Thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Steve Usillo, and I'm a partner at Cherry Beckert, and I lead the information assurance and cybersecurity practice. We have a great presentation planned today, offering up to 1 hour of CPE. Today's presentation will include myself, as well as Dan Sembler, who is also a partner at Cherry Beckert in the information assurance and cybersecurity practice. So stepping right in, I guess I'll do my my intro here, and then I'll hand it over to Dan. Our marketing team was very nice. They have 25 years of experience, but I got close to 30 years experience in the subject matter area. My experience ranges from SOC reporting, third-party risk and reporting, and cyber and privacy risk advisory services, which we'll step into a little bit here as we get into some of the services that we do perform. I'm currently a member of the AICPA ASEC, in addition to, which is the Assurance Services Executive Committee, in addition to the SOC 2 working group, and I've been on a number of different working groups related to privacy risk management and cybersecurity. Dan?
Yeah, hey y'all, thanks for joining. Dan Sembler, another partner in our information assurance and cybersecurity practice. I've been with the firm my entire professional career since an internship in 2008. Actually have a background in a more traditional financial audit practice, focusing in the technology and life sciences industries here, and then kind of transitioned into our risk advisory practice. Did some Sarbanes work, some SOC 404, risk assessments, vulnerability assessments, that type of stuff back in the early days, and then focusing more recently in SOC 1, SOC 2, and related kind of compliance reporting. See?
Excellent. Thank you, Dan. So Cherry Beckert is a full-service CPA firm. We are a top 25 firm and growing, just under about 600 million in revenue, approximately 2,500 employees, approximately 170 partners. And we have offices, probably over 30 offices throughout the US and international as well. Been in business for over 75 years. And like I said, still growing, fortunately. So very excited about being part of the firm and working with many of our larger organizations, middle market, and small organizations around the subject matter. So Cherry Beckert offers an array of different types of advisory services. We're part of what we would call the risk accounting and advisory service line. Within that service line, we kind of break our service offerings into some subcategories here, or what I would call subdomains. The first one is really around cybersecurity advisory services. So we provide an array of services to our clients, mainly around governance, risk, and compliance, and cyber and both privacy risk management. We provide technical cyber advisory services. We get involved in helping them with their security architectures, identity and access management, vulnerability penetration testing, both network and web application. We help with configuration management and helping for any type of technical security management. In addition, helping organizations navigate some of the more complex software development lifecycle strategies with on-prem, cloud development, so on and so forth. We provide incident response and breach coaching, security awareness training, in addition to cyber diligence, transaction advisory diligence, in addition to managed services. So we help our organizations in a way of augmenting their staff where independence is not an issue, to be able to do people, process, and technology to solution cyber augmentation. In the third-party reporting area, we provide, once again, all different types of services around helping organizations navigate what they need to in order to provide transparency into either their reporting requirements or based on contractual and regulatory obligations. So we provide SOC 1 reports, SOC 2, SOC 3. We provide readiness and other attestation services related to third-party criteria, which we'll talk to a little bit later in the presentation. We also provide high trust services as well as CMMCs. We've been around providing services around NIST 800-171 for many of our government contractors. But for those of you that know, the CMMC requirements are basically setting forth a lot of what's needed for government contractors in order to adhere to working within the government contract space and the government indirectly for purposes of securing controlled and classified information. So we work in that area as well, in addition to other third-party requirements such as FedRAMP, PCI, ISO, so on and so forth. So Dan?
Yep, appreciate it, guys. having trouble finding the mute button and cycle the slides at the same time. So appreciate your patience. Figured it would be helpful at the onset of the presentation to kind of talk about SOC 1 versus SOC 2, how they different and how they differ and how they're similar. Understanding that a large portion of the audience may also have some experience with SOC 1 and how that may kind of dovetail into a SOC 2 report. So just in brief summary, right at the onset here, SOC 1 and SOC 2 are very similar but different reports, right? They're really intended for different audiences, right? Common systems or services that you're typically going to see covered in like a SOC 1 report is going to be something related to your financial reporting processing or your ICFR control objectives or financial assertions. Comparatively, on the SOC 2 side, you're covering service commitments and system requirements related typically to a system or a service or an environment and infrastructure, something that a service organization is providing to a client base, or what SOC 2 is going to call a user entity base, right? So that's some of how the differences and how the reports are intended to be used or originate from. Example service organizations that you may see, again, this is not an exhaustive list, and certainly there are organizations that issue both SOC 1 and SOC 2, but just for comparison and illustrative purposes sake, a common SOC 1 reporting service organization would include a payroll processor, maybe a medical billing provider, something like that. Comparatively, on the SOC 2 side, you're more likely to see signature platforms, especially eSign, some of that stuff, office management systems, infrastructure environments, something like that, right? The subject matter we kind of already touched base on. The SOC 1 is going to be a lot more focused and intended for an ICFR, your internal control for financial reporting, sometimes more directly referenced or used in a Sarbanes-Oxley or a 404A or B type initiative. Comparatively for SOC 2, you're driving at service commitments and system requirements, which we'll define and talk about what those are later in the presentation here. Criteria that you're being graded, against or aligning your control objectives or your controls to achieve. Against ICFR and SOC 1, you're seeing a trend there, right? Really, the trust services criteria, which is a set of criteria that's been defined by the AICPA specifically for use in SOC 2 reports. And gives us kind of a standardized approach to make sure that SOC 2 reports are all able to be reviewed in the same fashion. Intended audience you'll see in SOC 1's a little bit more restricted, right? It's intended really for the service organization's user entities. Again, that's the customer base, right? And if the auditors of those user entities. SOC 2 is a bit broader. Sure, it can be distributed to user entities and their auditors, but it's broader in that it can also be an appropriate distribution or use for a potential business partner or potential client. So a little bit broader of the use case there. Moving forward, we often get questions in the difference between type 1 and type 2, right? A type 1 report is really going to be an as of a point in time, right? We're going to talk about very specific examples of auditor's language, what's covered in a report when you do a type 1, but just for the moment, just keep in mind a type 1 is really going to be an as of a point in time, a specified date. As of December 31st, 2023, here were our controls, or here was our system description, right? Comparatively, a type 2 is going to cover everything that's in a type 1, but extend the auditor's opinion to cover operating effectiveness controls over a period of time, right? So that's the key critical component for this slide. Really, it's just type 1 is as of a specified date. Type 2 is a period of time. Okay. Again, we've touched on this very briefly, but on the left, you're going to see SOC 1 is going to cover more of your traditional financial statement assertions, your accuracy, evaluation, existence, completeness, so on and so forth. SOC 2 is a bit broader. It's really based on the service commitments and system requirements that are prescribed or promised to a user entity base on how data is going to be protected, how a system may be available, how the system is going to transact with your systems and your individuals. So you're going to see a much broader set of potential control activities that are going to be covered. Anything from background checks to authentication configurations, SIM logging and monitoring, system availability, much broader. Right, absolutely some overlap from SOC 1 to SOC 2, and we'll show you some examples of that as well. But SOC 2, just as a reporting framework, is typically broader. We get questions often on what the process is. As a service organization, I've never issued a SOC 2 report. What do I do? That typically is going to start with most CPA firms, and we're included in this as well, in some sort of readiness or gap assessment process. Right, that's going to be a process that helps the service organization become acquainted with the criteria, right? What is required to be disclosed in a SOC 2 report? what are some common control elements that you should expect to be included. It's very important to note that SOC 2 is not going to prescribe controls the way some other compliance type initiatives may, but there are market expectations on how data can be protected or transmitted or maybe encrypting under certain protocols or something of that standard. And that'll be identified and discussed through our readiness process. The purpose really of that readiness process is to identify the critical service commitments that are made on behalf of the service providers to their users. So do they make promises through their MSAs or their contractual documents that promise that email is always going to be encrypted when it's sent back and forth, or that databases are encrypted under a certain algorithm or protocol, and then establishing controls to be able to demonstrate competency or compliance with those service commitments, right? After finishing that readiness assessment, again, broad timelines, it can be a little bit shorter than this, or it can be much longer depending on the complexity or just the timeline that an organization has to comply with. But that readiness assessment can take anywhere from 3 to 6 months on average. Again, can take longer, can sometimes be a little bit shorter, but I think 3 to 6 months to get through that process, and then you're at a decision point, right? You can issue a type 1 report, right? Certainly a separate examination, or it's a standalone examination. Again, that's the type 1 as of a specified point in time report that is going to cover the completeness and the accuracy of your system description in accordance with disclosure criteria, as well as the design of controls, again, as of a point in time. Or you can go straight into a type 2, where you're going to cover, again, completeness and the accuracy of the system description, the design of controls, but also the operating effectiveness of those controls over that period of time. I've done that a couple times. Steve already alluded to this a bit. We're going to get into some specific examples in a little bit in this presentation, but through that readiness process, you also have the option to start to consider and potentially include in subsequent examinations other third-party criteria. We have an example here for emergency MMC requirements. Is there a way to include some of those types of requirements? We see a lot of requests in the HIPAA space as well for additional criteria that we added to the scope of the SOC 2. That will give some of those. So that takes us to polling question number 1. Has your company performed a SOC 1 or a SOC 2? And I will try to pop up our chat and Q&A real quick to make sure we don't have any questions coming in. We'll typically, again, we'll keep this open for about a minute just to give people a chance to respond. And Steve and I will typically take this as a time to start answering some questions if there are any.
I think that said, feel free to put your questions up into the Q&A section. Like Dan had said, we're very happy to address any specific questions we can as we go through the presentation, and anything that we can't address during the presentation, we'd be happy to follow up with post the presentation. So, how are we doing on results? Not sure if they can see it
I haven't
tabulating as it goes through or not.
Yeah, haven't seen them yet.
Okay, that'd be interesting to see.
Okay, there you go. And I think we're sharing out. So 58% most common response is no, we haven't issued a SOC report yet. SOC 1 or SOC 2. We do have 20%, 19% that are issuing both, and then a subset within 12 and 11 that are issuing either SOC 1 or 2. So good mix for this group.
I think it's also interesting to note here that while you have some folks that have a SOC 1 that are really geared on concentrating on those financial reporting assertions and processes and those objectives, the SOC 2, as we'll speak to here, operations and compliance driven, you get a pretty good mark of folks that are dealing with that as it pertains to demonstrating vendor due diligence. But it's not uncommon for organizations to get both. Reason being is because the nature of their systems is relevant to both their user entities' financial reporting, as well as the operations and compliance initiatives that they may have. So certainly not uncommon to see both in the way of going through that.
Absolutely.
So because of the makeup of our group here and attendees, I'm sure we have some folks that are new to SOC and others that are more advanced and have, obviously been through this process. So some of this information is going to be reviewed for them. But collectively, Dan and I wanted to provide a session that focused not only on the basics of SOC reporting, but also a deeper dive into some of the more specific SOC 2 reporting elements, with specific considerations to keep in mind when you're looking to add value to a SOC 2. One of the things we talk to our clients about all the time is obviously, there are certain elements of a SOC 2 as you go through and do what you need to do to provide the report consistent with the standards, consistent with the guides, so on and so forth. But you do have the ability to add value in that report to be more transparent with elements within the system description, as well as the controls that you bring in to scope in order to do that. So there'll be elements of the SOC 2 guide that we'll certainly be including in this. There was a new SOC 2 guide released last year, in addition to the updated description criteria, which we'll refer to as DC 200, that many of you are probably familiar with, which is a description criteria that's used in order to make sure the description is complete and accurate. Our hope and intention is that the discussion points and considerations will provide value in not only to the service organizations, but to user entities and other service auditors, that might be listening in. So what is the SOC 2 report? Dan kind of talked a little bit about this as he went through his opening statements there. And I think one of the things that he brought up that's really important is SOC is a reporting framework. It's really a vehicle and a mechanism for organizations to report on a system of internal control related to their service level commitments for the system that they're actually operating. It allows the service organizations to provide transparency around those systems and controls that are needed, once again, to meet those commitments. But in a SOC 1, as you recall from earlier on, that's really geared on those financial statement objectives and assertions. So the completeness and accuracy of transactions, so on and so forth. So in summary, when you're thinking about, what do I do, SOC 1, SOC 2, think SOC 2 is really operations and compliance driven, and SOC 1 is really controls over financial reporting. If it's relevant to the financial reporting and the financial statement assertions to your user entities or customers, you are going to be leaning on that SOC 1. And once again, there are many situations where both come into play. SOC engagements are attestation engagements. So they are the highest level of insurance that a CPA firm can deliver. The SOC 2 provides flexibility to customers in reporting in their systems and their controls, again, around not only the service level commitments, but against the specific prescribed criteria, which we'll talk to in a little bit. Those are really the trust service criteria that we'll dive into, and elements of that later on in the presentation. But potentially, as Dan had mentioned, some elements of specific third-party criteria can be worked into that as well. SOC is not a certification. Again, it's an attestation. It's really reporting on the internal control structure, and it includes a service auditor opinion, management assertion, the system description, which again is usually based on a criteria of DC 200, in the details of that criteria. The controls, along with the control tests and the results of those tests, is also presented. So it provides, especially in a type 2, where you have the operating effectiveness, so not only the design of the controls, but also the operating effectiveness of the controls. That allows user organizations to really get a good understanding on the maturity of the controls and how thorough they've been tested to meet their expectations in their risk management process. So again, in addition to the standards, the SOC 2 guide is something that certainly provides value as you're going through this process. And the service auditors obviously use that as a way to gauge certain elements of approach and other questions that may come along the way. When the SOC 2 guide was actually updated based on the SOC 2 working group, a couple things to consider. There are artifacts that are up on the AICPA's website that actually do track changes or show the changes within the description criteria. So what's been updated through that process, as well as the trust services categories and the criteria there. Now, keep in mind, the categories and the criteria itself did not change. However, many of the points of focus were readdressed and elaborated on. So that was a pretty good exercise amongst the group to try to take into account several other very common third-party criteria that we'll mention later on as a few examples, in order to make sure that the points of focus were complete depending on the goals of the service organization and what they reported on. So that's exciting when you want to provide a deeper level of transparency around the controls that you have and the defense in depth strategy that you have. So a key part of what we look at in a SOC 2, or any SOC for that matter, is really the system description. And once again, that system description for the SOC 2 is going to be predicated on DC 200. But it's also an area of information that can be presented at the appropriate level of detail to accommodate user entities and the service organization's reporting objectives. So the types of services or the types of things that you typically see in there is prescribed based on certain elements here in the right-hand column, where you have the actual criteria, DC 200, and you have the 9 different DC components there. But it includes the types of services that will help identify people, process, and technology around the systems, the data and transactions that might be in scope. So, for example, if we're following confidential information or covered information, whether it's in healthcare, EPHI, or it could be CUI for controlled and classified information in the CMMC space. It could be card holder data or card processing, card data for purposes of PCI, so on and so forth. So whatever that classification model may be, it looks through that data through the life cycle from origination all the way to, I'll call it grave, depending on the boundaries of the report. It also assists report users in understanding the risks around the service organization in not meeting the service level commitments. So as organizations go through their risk assessment process, they're looking at that system description, they're understanding the way in which they operate with that service provider and trying to understand some of the major elements of their risk assessment, whether or not they're fulfilled or there's elements of compensating measures they need to consider in order to mitigate the risk working with that third-party provider. System descriptions also used to understand the proper disclosure and classification of third parties involved in that transaction lifecycle. So is there a subservice organization or are they a vendor, right? And Dan will talk a little bit about some of that later on. The system description will also help identify appropriate responsibilities or any shared responsibilities to meet those service level commitments. It helps in understanding complementary subservice organization controls, which are the controls you would expect the subservice organization to have in order to meet and fulfill the service level commitments, in addition to complementary user entity controls, which are controls that you would expect the user entities to have in order to also fulfill the service level commitments. Dan will speak to this later on, but you'll see that CUEC's complementary user entity controls may be a bit more common in a SOC 1 because you're looking at overall objectives from a transaction perspective, whereas in a SOC 2, while they can exist, they're less likely to be in there only because of the fact that the service organization is usually designing its service level commitments around what it can control as it pertains to their overall risk assessment process and the controls that they identify and develop. There's also customer responsibilities. So that's something that can be presented in the system description as well, where it may not be impactful to meet the service level commitments, but they are recommendations that the user entity can look at or the customers can look at when reading the report to think about that. And as an auditor for an organization that's using a subservice organization, that can provide value both from a CSOC perspective, as well as understanding the controls that my client may need as the user entity auditor, in addition to whatever requirements they have, so that I know that they're doing the right thing in order to best minimize risk working with that provider or that subservice organization. So it does provide it also provides a very careful and complete evaluation of these elements for report users so they can understand the scope and responsibilities. When working with a particular industry, it's also important to know the user's expectations for coverage based on industry regulations, requirements, and maybe contractual commitments, as well as inherent risk factors. So from that perspective, when reading the system description, if you know that that particular subservice or service organization is working in the healthcare space, then you may have certain elements of that covered that specifically relate to HIPAA security, breach notification, and maybe privacy requirements, so on and so forth. So, and once again, we'll talk a little bit about that later, but the system description is a very powerful tool that you certainly want to encourage a comfortable level of verbosity there so that, once again, the user organizations really get value out of the report. It also allows for the user entities to understand if there are any exceptions or any other particular design elements that would be of concern. Hopefully that's not the case, and that would come through and flush through the element of testing that you'd see. But any other potential third-party criteria that's needed, making sure that it's complete and accurate. And you should see that flow through to the points of focus, which we'll talk through later on as well, depending on what they brought in for coverage. So Dan alluded to this in the table earlier, but this is just a graphical representation of the report usage for SOC 1. So we have our service provider, which in this case is a payroll service provider. Obviously, the results of any reports and transaction processing is relevant to the customer's financial reporting. So all the different customers and their auditors are going to be going through their process of measuring up engagement risk and audit risk and everything else that goes along with it. And as part of that, they're looking at how they're working with these providers and the numbers that they're getting, that they're using for financial reporting they're going to be looking at the controls that the customer has around that, in addition to what the provider is actually executing on to make sure that they can assign the appropriate level of risk. And that's really the value in reviewing that SOC 1 report. So the service auditor works for that service provider, creates a SOC 1 report that is available for distribution to the appropriate users that are using it for their controls over financial reporting obligations. The next slide is going to be really around SOC 2. So SOC 2 is similar, but again, operations and compliance. So we have a particular service provider, could be a cloud provider, could be, technology, SaaS offering, or it could be an MSP, it could be just about anything, but it's a system that basically is needed by third parties. And it could be customers, business partners, prospects, regulators, so on and so forth. It could also be the auditors of customers or interested parties that are aware of how a SOC 2 is utilized. So the SOC 2 auditor is once again engaged by the service provider to provide a report that meets the requirements and provides value to the folks below it here. Once again, the customer, partners, prospects, and regulators. So with that being said, it's really important for the organization to assess what each of these parties may be looking for within that report. And obviously providing enough value there. So when they do receive the report, it's not just a checkbox, it's really understanding, what it is that they're looking to cover, depending on the nature of what they're looking at. So it's all around the service level commitments. But again, if you think there's going to be regulators involved and you're falling within a particular area of operation that's highly regulated, then you can add value to that description. You can add value based on those controls and tie those back into the appropriate criteria and points of focus so that folks can measure up the appropriate maturity when they read the report. Another part of that, which is also, contingent upon the system description, is really the system boundaries. This becomes critically important for organizations to understand the scope and the overall boundaries of the report. What is it that the service organization's team, so to speak, is responsible for? Whose responsibility is it to fulfill certain obligations? And if it's other third parties that are involved, how is that handled? Is it a subservice organization? Is it a vendor? In addition, as I said earlier, if there are specific responsibilities that flow down to the customers themselves. So when you look at the system boundaries, it's definitely a critical and important point of the system descriptions, and it needs to be fully understood and clear on what the scope would be. There are a number of different things that the system boundaries can actually help ensure. It can help the completeness of the technologies and the locations that store, process, or transmit that covered information that we spoke to. So depending on, once again, on what's included in that for, say, confidential information, personal information, CUI or EPHI, so on and so forth. It's identifying the relevant third parties and their functions and how those systems interact between the boundaries and the scope of the report. Any applicable data centers or cloud providers or locations that might be in scope, or in some environments, not only what's in scope, but potentially highlighting what could be out of scope based on particular measures. It also helps the service organization, the auditors, and the users understand the completeness and accuracy of the testing procedures. So when you look at the boundaries and you look at the actual detail of the systems involved, you would expect that the controls that are applied are going across all of the relevant boundaries within the report as you're doing your risk assessment. The additional value of the report is contingent upon a clarity and level of transparency, with those boundaries in those complex environments, and they should be reflective of such information that's being reported on. So the service organization has specific commitments and obligations related to that industry. Once again, they may want to concentrate and fixate in on bringing in that value there. An example of this may be an organization that is reporting on, say, CMMC, as Dan had alluded to earlier in the slides, in their SOC. They have a couple of options. They could do their SOC report traditionally on the trust service categories, and they could map all of the controls and requirements within the appropriate points of focus. Or they could do what's called a SOC 2 Plus, which we'll talk to, where they can actually not only map the controls in, but they could also identify those controls in the system description, in addition to having the auditor opine on not only their service commitments to the trust service categories, but also to the CMMC requirements. It's not a certification, but it does allow them to opine on the controls relevant to their CMMC expectations and the controls that are used to do that. So the next thing we'll talk about here that's important is what we would call inherent risk. So obviously during that risk assessment process, the service order and service organization's risk assessment procedures begin with inherent risk. It's looking at all the different aspects, and some of the common inherent risk factors are maybe any new or changed controls, system changes, maybe a significant change in processing volume, new personnel, significant changes in the types of transactions or products or technologies, maybe even modifications to the service auditor opinion in prior years, or exceptions or deviations that they've had. Those are all things that the auditor and the service organization certainly want to be aware of when understanding the risk to their service level commitments. But these inherent risk factors certainly can include inherent risk from third-party providers as well. So that's something that needs to be considered as well, depending on your relationship. One thing that I like to talk to service organizations about is when you're thinking about an inherent risk, take it a step further. In the cyber threat landscape, there's a number of different public, I'll say documentation, literature, and publications that come out about the threat landscape and what are the different types of attacks and the different nature of breaches that occur. And when you look at your overall system of controls and the design, you'll want to think about some of those inherent risks and making sure that the report is properly addressed. So for example, if you look at some of the ones in the SOC 2 on the bottom right there, you think about ransomware and malware. Obviously, there's a high likelihood of those types of attacks, phishing and credential attacks, any types of attacks against endpoints, making sure that the right endpoint detection and response software is in place, the right incident response protocols, making sure systems are designed with the right configuration controls in order to catch any configuration drift or any misconfigurations, and of course, a sound vulnerability management program, things like that. So when doing that, obviously, you're taking into account some of those particular threats, and you're presenting that to the reader of the report, who's also thinking about how you may be designing your controls to minimize the risk of those threats that are constantly publicized. And as you're assessing these risks, obviously, in order to get proper residual risk, the service organization is really looking at the design and effectiveness of those particular controls to make sure everything is proper. I'll give you an example. If you have an organization that has developed an enclave for their production, a separate production environment, mainly for reporting on their SOC 2, they may have a system or a technology that's embedded that synchronizes with a back office environment that's out of scope for their SOC. However, the synchronization is real time. Let's just say that the back office environment, not included by the SOC, gets hit with ransomware. It infects that environment that then synchronizes into the production environment, and you're doing a SOC 2 in that production environment, reporting on availability, you now have a problem. So it's important to think about those boundaries and understand the risk of the way in which technologies operate between either other systems or other third parties.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, one of the other topics that we wanted to make sure we covered, and you've heard this referenced a couple of times throughout the presentation already, is the contemplation of the use of third parties in the support of services or a system that's provided, right? Very common in SOC 2 reports anymore, especially with the prevalence of kind of the big three cloud service providers in terms of hosting a platform and infrastructure where underlying system or services or applications can reside that our service organizations may be providing to their user agents, right? One of the things that's becoming apparent, especially with the prevalence of supply chain attack and very specific inquiries and protections and market expectations, along with how we protect against supply chain attack, monitoring of third parties is becoming critical, right? There are specific criteria within the SOC 2 pro services criteria that speak to how you're identifying critical service organizations and what monitoring you're doing on an ongoing basis to ensure they're still upholding their end of the bargain when it comes to protecting the boundaries of that environment. And any underlying data that is stored on servers or databases or environments that they're helping you support. So the distinction between a vendor and a subservice organization is critical, right? And the thought process to go through to determine which is more applicable is, first, are there services that are provided by a third party? If so, then at a minimum, they're a vendor, right? They're a third party. If the services that are provided by that third party, if the service organizations are auditee in this example, it does not maintain the control or does not have sufficient control that they are responsible for to achieve service commitments that are promised to clients, then that vendor is then promoted or escalated to a subservice organization, right? That's going to be somebody that's typically explicitly called out in a SOC 2 report, along with the assumptions that the service organization makes in terms of what controls are ongoing and operating effectively at that subservice organization to make sure that their commitments are upheld. That is a specific disclosure requirement, and we'll get into the specifics of PC 200 in the coming slides. But the identification of those vendors and which ones have been promoted or elevated to that subservice organization level, and the underlying controls that we expect that are in place is a required element in a SOC 2 report. One additional distinction you'll occasionally hear organizations talk about the approach for an inclusive versus a carve-out. There really is two different ways to treat the subservice organization in a SOC 2 report. The most common by far is the carve-out approach, which is that scenario that I just described, where management of the service organization is responsible for disclosing the controls that they expect to be in place at the subservice organization, so at their level that they're aligned to achieve their service commitments. Right. Conversely, far less often used is the inclusive method, where you actually can be engaged to perform an audit of the controls that are expected to be in place at that subservice organization, and those control elements, the tests or the procedures performed over those controls and those conclusions can actually be brought into the scope or within the boundaries of a SOC 2 report. And not super common, but is something that is available. We've touched on or referenced service commitments and system requirements several times throughout this presentation. Thought it would make sense to kind of take a deeper dive into that. What's the difference and why are they both required, right? On the service commitment side, these are declarations that are made by the service organization management to the broad range of their user entities that they're providing their system or their service or their infrastructure or what have you to, right? Those commitments are typically communicated through some sort of standardized contract. It could be individual agreements, could be NSAs, could be statements of work, it could be published statements, it could be privacy statements that are made on the public website, but it's a declaration typically made in writing, right, to the broad user entity base. Along that note, it's important to note that SOC 2 reports are typically in their most normal, I guess, incarnation, are most typically thought of as a broad issuance report, meaning you have, in that example that Steve had a couple slides ago, it's one report that goes to a broad range of user entities and prospects and business associates and regulators all together. So when you're talking about scoping the boundaries and you're talking about identifying appropriate levels of service commitments to bring into scope, you've got to keep that in mind. You don't want to scope your environment so prescriptive or so specific to one user entity or one client that isn't applicable to the broad range of services that you provide. Something to keep in mind. On the system requirement side, right, these are the technical specifications about how a system should be functioning in order to allow the organization's service to be achieved, right? They could make system requirements to specific customers. They could be in response to specific law or regulation. And it could be, again, market expectations related to guidelines of industry groups that they participate in, something along those lines, right? Those requirements are often specified in a service organization's suite of system policies, procedures. It could be embedded in their system design documentation. Again, you're going to see some references into contracts or contractual vehicles with our customers, and could even be prescribed upon them from certain government regulations. Okay, if that makes sense. Steve had alluded to this earlier. There is an emerging contemplation and focus, I guess we should say, in the SOC 2 guides and emerging standards for the distinction between a user entity responsibility and a user entity control, right? The easiest way to start to think about this is very similar to how we think about those vendors versus subservice organizations, right? You have a suite of vendors, third party, that are providing service to you, or you have a certain subset of those vendors that are elevated to a subservice organization due to the nature and the materiality of the service that they provide and how that impacts your service commitments, right? Customer or company under user entity controls are thought of the same way, right? There certainly are expectations of things that the customer has to perform on their own to derive the intended benefit from your system or your service or whatever you're providing for them, right? If that the nature of what the customer or the
client has to perform is so material that it actually impacts the service organization's ability to achieve those service commitments, again, that gets promoted up to a CUC or a complementary user entity control. So again, specific guidance from the ICPA disclosure criteria for the identification specifically of the CUCs and the underlying control criteria that can be impacted if the user organizations of the clients don't uphold their end market. That does get us to polling question number 2, which
So Dan, before you
Yeah.
jump into the polling question real quick, while people are answering the question, there was a question posted. How does a user entity go about documenting CUECs, which I think you talked about here in the slide, but you can reiterate that. And there's a question about and testing them. So I think it's important to talk about responsibilities around CUECs from a service auditor perspective versus the user entity and their auditors.
Yeah, really good question. And so the polling question should be up for people to answer. Which disclosure criteria, we did discuss this. It was in the slides there. So give me a minute to discuss that now. From the service auditor's perspective, right? The CU that's the thought process. Has management or has the service organization properly identified the control responsibilities that are going to be required of user entities in order to achieve those service commitments? From the customer's auditor's perspective, right? That's more often you're gonna encounter that in a SOC 1 type space where there's actually going to be a mapping, and from getting back to my days in audit, right? And how these reports are intended to be used. The CUECs can be an actual roadmap or almost an audit program for expectations of what the user entity has to uphold before they rely on the intended benefit or the output from any system in SOC 1, right? So if you have an example in a SOC 1, or it could be in a SOC 2 that says the user entity is responsible for approving new user access to the systems so that only appropriate people can process transactions or see QE or whatever. The user auditor can actually use that as a roadmap to go back to the user entity, the client, and say, what do you have in place to make sure that you're only approving access for your own individuals to that system or that service or that. Okay. Results of polling question number 2, 52% DC2. The answer is actually DC3. Little nuance, right? Kind of a trick question there. And again, we'll dive into the disclosure criteria here in a minute. Steve, I think we're going to go back to you real quickly to go through kind of suitability of the criteria and additional criteria we can pull in, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So SOC 2 Plus, we've mentioned that a few times. It really offers a service organization to opine not only on the trust service categories to meet their commitments, but also additional third-party criteria. So that provides for a significant level of flexibility and transparency related to the users. But one thing to consider, to include additional criteria in a SOC 2, it needs to be suitable. The prescribed criteria in the SOC 2, as said before, is when you think about security, availability, confidentiality, privacy, integrity, processing integrity and privacy, those are all those categories that you'd include. And they include not only the subset of criteria, but additional points of focus that you can dive into that you don't have to measure up and do all of them, but what's relevant for those service level commitments. While those were updated last year to fall in line with many of the current offerings to provide that flexibility to service auditors, once again, it's up to the service organization to make that determination to add that value. I think when you are thinking about how you're going to report on a third-party criteria for purposes of a SOC 2 Plus, you have to understand what is the subject matter that makes up the particular elements of the criteria. And in a SOC 2 Type 1, you have the description, the information that's in the description, and the design of controls. Again, that description is predicated on DC 200. Is it accurate and complete? And have the controls been designed to mitigate the risk of not having a problem with the service level commitments? But in a Type 2, it's all of what we just talked about in a Type 1, but it's also the operating effectiveness. So when you're evaluating that criteria, you need to be aware of what suitable criteria may be as defined by what we just recently talked about. So when you think of suitable criteria, it has to be relevant to the underlying subject matter. That's why we defined subject matter earlier. Is it objective? Is it free from bias? Is it measurable? Can you get a reasonably consistent measurement, both quantitative and qualitative, of the underlying subject matter? Is it complete? Is the criteria complete? in making sure that it doesn't omit any critical information as it pertains to that criteria. The report value can be driven on how complete you are in meeting the appropriate points of focus relevant to that criteria and relevant to the service level commitments. Go ahead, Dan. So these were the typical criteria that you see in a SOC report. There's a common criteria that falls in line with security. Then you have availability, confidentiality, privacy, and processing integrity. Again, when you step into each of those, the next slide is going to show you, you have kind of this subset of the criteria. So under the security category, which is the common criteria, you have CC1 through CC9, which is really based on COSO, by the way, where you have all these elements that are prescribed in the category, subcategories of the actual security criteria. So CC1 is the common criteria for the control environment, so on and so forth. As you step deeper into, say, CC6, so we'll go to the next one, which is logical and physical access, you'll see that there's a subcategory or subcriteria of CC6.3. And within CC6.3, you have these points of focus. And once again, when you identify your controls and you try to take into consideration the completeness of the controls to meet your service level commitments, you're going to go through each of these points of focus and make sure that you're complete. Obviously, if you have other third-party criteria that you're bringing in, you're going to map that to those points of focus to make sure that you have the completeness of all of that. And then depending on the level of transparency that you feel is appropriate in the circumstances, you're going to have that information covered not only in the system description, but in the controls that map back to the points of focus to fulfill your requirements. When we talked about those additional, the overall points of focus, what you'll find is depending on the criteria that you select, there may be additional components to that, right? So for example, if you're looking at a particular report where you're doing security and you're going through the common criteria, but you're also doing privacy, you may be looking at certain elements of additional points of focus that you need to bring into consideration. So if you added confidentiality, you may have to bring those points in. If you have privacy, there's other elements to bring in. One thing that's really important, and there was further emphasis in the SOC 2 guide to clarify, is that while the common criteria concentrates much on what you would typically see in a security report, if you were doing something like privacy, keep in mind that that common criteria still applies, but it's not just with a security lens. So for example, you may have a situation where obviously when it comes to proper training and awareness. So in the security area, we understand what security awareness training is, but when it comes to privacy risk, you have to know that they have a privacy risk management training program as well, right? So each of the criteria you bring in, you have to address those common criteria in addition to the additional points of focus. So that becomes really important for the completeness of the coverage of the report. Next slide kind of gives just some examples of different third-party criteria that you may be up against. Organizations ask all the time, whether they should go one route or the other. Some of that's predicated on contractual requirements. Some of these particular elements are more common in different industries or international types of situations where they're working more with international groups, so on and so forth. Certainly things that you can navigate as you go through each one of these. But overall, the report can be designed as such to provide the value based on those service level commitments that either implicitly or explicitly covers some of these components. It's just a matter of how you structure that report based on some of our earlier conversations. Okay, so when you look at other third-party criteria, one of the things to consider here is really around the level of mapping that you typically see when you bring other third-party requirements into it. So for example, in this demonstration here, we have the NIST requirement that's being brought in for the NIST cybersecurity framework. And you'll see that you can definitely have a one-to-many mapping as it pertains to the points of focus. So it's not uncommon that while you have one particular point of focus, there may be 2, 3, 4, 8, 9, whatever it is, NIST references in this case that line up to that. So you can clearly see how much more in depth you can provide when it comes to value to organizations that are looking specifically for other third-party criteria components. So the management of that can sometimes be challenging, but it's important to notice that there are different ways in which organizations can navigate that. It's very common for organizations to use some type of a GRC tool to keep track of their controls and the different requirements across different regulatory expectations. So GRC tools can be certainly a value to an organization that has a more mature element of reporting requirements. It can streamline certain things as it pertains to sharing information with the service auditor and the service organization themselves. Here at Cherry Bekaert, we support a number of different tools. We're partnered with different GRC providers. However, that said, it's really important to understand that GRC tools are considered, in many cases, a system of internal control, depending on how you're using them. If you're using it as a document repository, it's one thing, but in many of the more modern GRC tools, there's API and other type of internal control integration that allows a GRC tool to gather information from the systems that are in scope, pull that information down, build triggers and exception reports, so on and so forth, that allows critical decision-making and risk evaluation through that process. Therefore, that particular system can be part of that internal control process. So it's really important that the service auditor needs to be independent of the use and the configuration of that tool, much because it is part of their internal control structure. And any information that you receive from that, because it's a tool that's collecting information from other sources, is treated like what we call IPE, or information provided by the entity. So the auditor needs to still test the completeness and accuracy of what's collected, and in addition to some integration testing on how it's being reported and how it's actually calling out exceptions. But again, the ability for organizations to kind of do those mappings and bring that comprehensive information in is certainly readily available. The next slide here is really just an example. Oh, we're on a polling question. Excellent. This type of SOC report tests the operating effectiveness of controls.
Thanks, Steve. And then while people are answering that, okay. Yeah, well, we're giving people a minute to answer that. You know, we've got somebody says, you know, they manage their ISO 27001 and SOC 2 audits for 50-person company. You know, how does the workload to manage those audits or the complexity scale as they move to 100, 250, 500, 10,000 person company? And I can take a little bit of that. So, you know, that's where some of the use of these GRC solutions, and typically the larger the organization gets, the more likely you're going to have a need to help organize those controls and the control libraries and see how a specific control maps out to different criteria amongst different reports, right? There are obviously, you know, complexities that go along with an organization increasing in scale. From the auditor's perspective, there's more to audit. There are higher sample sizes. From the service organization's perspective, right? On the flip side, there is a little bit of economies of scale, right? You know, as you're documenting a control library for one initiative, there's going to be a lot of initiative with a lot of overlap with another one. Same thing's true whether you're provisioning access for 10 new hires or 1,000 new hires. If you have a stated process, if you're following the same policy or procedure, that can be done a lot quicker. If we want to give the results for poll 3, I can jump up to poll 4.
Yeah, Dan, you can do that. I'll also add some context there. Go ahead and read the results off, and then I'll add some context.
Results, 36% was the highest for SOC 2. It's actually type 2 that covers the operating effectiveness over a period of time. So a bit of a trick question there. We did get 34% there. And then I think we wanted to pop over to poll 4 to make sure people are getting their polls in, Steve. But if you want to get that, we'll pull
why don't you jump on poll 4, and I'll answer some of what you have for the question here.
Okay.
Yeah, I think overall, depending on the size of the organization, you're going to have different elements of your control structure that are systemically applied, whether at an entity level or specific to different systems that can be leveraged. However, obviously, the bigger the organization, the more complex the technology becomes a factor in documenting and performing the tests of controls. In addition, the number of resources that are included in a larger organization is usually larger. So in a smaller organization, you may be able to tackle multiple control statements and categories related to 1 or 2 or 3 different control owners, whereas in a larger organization, you know, just going through, you know, human capital, HR, and some of the onboarding and offboarding, you may have 6 people in the room going through that process. So, or multiple interviews. So it really just depends on the complexity of the systems and everything else that's aligned. But everything that Dan said too is very much relevant for that. Okay, so Dan, I think we can step back and We got
Yep.
5 minutes left, if I'm not mistaken. Is that it?
Yeah. All right. So polling question for 84% not sure if they've got to issue SOC 1 or SOC 2 reports again. That's going to be derived based on, regulatory customer requirements, something along those lines. And that's where you start looking at those initiatives. We can
Excellent.
go real quick through a couple of the last slides, the last 4 minutes. We've touched on this a number of times, the difference between a type 1 and a type 2, and how the auditor's opinion in a type 1 touches an as of period of time or as of a specified date, no coverage of operating effectiveness, right? You got to go into type 2 before you get operating effectiveness, and that's where you cover a period of time. We hit the restricted use a little bit earlier, those graphical representations that Steve had shared, right? How the intended use of a SOC 2 report is a little bit broader, right? We've covered the system description in a couple of different slides already. Again, DC3 is where you're going to cover the boundaries or the components of the system that you're going to cover in your report. DC4, we get a lot of questions on. That's where you have to explicitly disclose if you had a security incident or a breach, what was the nature of the incident, what was the timeline to respond, how have you responded, are we still responding, right? All of that goes into DC4. Again, there are 9 disclosure criteria that have to be explicitly included in a SOC 2 report for the auditor to be able to confirm that description or the report is complete and accurate. Yeah, I mean, after that, we're getting into section 4. This is where the auditor's results and procedures performed are explicitly documented. This is also where we're commonly sharing the trust services criteria that are going to be in scope. So if it's security, all of those underlying sub criteria, as well as the controls that the service organization has identified to achieve their service commitments related to those criteria, right? Section 4 is also where you're going to see explicit disclosure of the procedures performed and the conclusions. Those procedures, when written from the auditor, are supposed to really use one of these 4 main firms. And the way the AICPA documentation kind of builds on itself, right, as you move from left to right, you're increasing in the level of assurance. Right? In our methodology, we're typically going to start with an inquiry through our walkthroughs, right? How is the control intended to operate? How is it designed? How is it supposed to work? And then you go on to go up the scale to how you test the control, right? Are we observing something like a door that is locked or a camera that's up in the corner, or are we inspecting a piece of evidence like a, say a system access listing that came out of an identity access management system, something like that, or re-performing something more common in the SOC 1, but an element, an output from the system. Are we recalculating a system calculation or completeness and accuracy of, say, a user listing that's come out of the system, something like that? So that's just a graphical representation of how you move on through that. This is
so again, I can take the next 2 slides and wrap us right in, so it's fine.
Yeah.
So basically, this slide right here is a typical section 4 disclosure of what things would look like for purposes of understanding what criteria is brought in, what is management identified as the proper control to mitigate the risk, in addition to the test of the control that's really being performed by the service auditor, and then any of the results of the test. This is pretty standard for many of you that have been through a SOC 2 report. However, one thing we wanted to note is that with the recent updates to the guide, and obviously organizations electing to report on multiple criteria, you can have a different and flexible approach to this. We've seen where organizations have led with the actual control and then presented the mapping to the appropriate multiple criteria that they're reporting on, including the trust service categories, in addition to other third-party criteria. And then they would include the test of the controls that are in there and the results of the tests, all at the appropriate level to cover the third-party criteria. The next slide is really just around section 4, which is unaudited. I'm sorry, section 5, which is unaudited. Typically, there's a disclaimer of an opinion that's presented in the auditor report. While, this is something that's unaudited, your service auditor, will typically just make sure that it's reasonably accurate as it pertains to what you're disclosing, and it's appropriate, I should say, for the circumstances. But it could also be information provided by the service organization themselves. It could be responses to exceptions, maybe giving further clarity on a particular policy or response process. It could also be mapping to other frameworks that are not necessarily covered. So a lot of value in that section of the report. That concludes our webinar. Thanks again for joining us. If you have any additional questions regarding today's topic, please don't hesitate to reach out. If there are questions that we can identify based on folks that have actually asked them, we can certainly follow up post the webinar as well. We value your feedback and ask that you take part in a short survey which will appear when you leave the session. Thanks again for joining us. It's been a real pleasure, and have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.